takes care of our kind of our Illinois WorkNet technical assistance is still out this week. She has another project that she's working on this week, and so I wanted to take an opportunity to discuss a couple of things with you, and we probably won't go really long today. Natasha and I have been working on a handful of things for the WorkNet, some additional tools that should be up and running soon. And so we're going to try to get these things going and available for you. Hopefully, though, you've had some success using the WorkNet so far, and we're continuing to try to get it to the point where eventually we want it to be. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about today were the actual job placements, because ultimately that is one of the main goals for CYEP. It's really kind of the main goal, is to take youth and to place them into a job. And I know we've had discussions about how in the past some of the purpose of CYEP was, it looked different. CYEP has evolved a little bit over time, and it made a significant change when it came to the bureau that I work for, which is the Bureau of Youth Intervention Services here. Our office is based in Springfield, and we're part of DHS's Division of Family and Community Services. And so the program changed. So if some of you have been doing CYEP for some time now, you may remember it differently. You may be familiar with it a little bit differently. But the major change, as far as I understand it to be, just from my discussions with providers over time, the major change is that when our bureau took over the program in FY17, the focus was really on long-term employment. Now, in the past, a big focus on CYEP was the idea that we're going to give youth jobs for a short time. You know, we had the Summer Youth Employment Program, and the idea was we were going to have subsidized youth jobs for the short term. But that is really not the focus of CYEP anymore. The focus of CYEP is long-term, unsubsidized employment. And the idea is that we want to use CYEP to kind of jumpstart that. The youth that we are working with are youth that may have struggled with employment in the past, may have current barriers to employment. Yancy, I'm reading, it says, my browser says nothing is being shared. I am not sharing my screen at the moment just because I don't have anything on the WorkNet to share right at the moment. So, but I may here shortly share just a part of the notice of funding opportunity here as we go through some of this. But I wanted to discuss, again, with the job placements, that we're working really hard to get people, to get the youth that we serve into long-term unsubsidized jobs. And the idea with the subsidy is that we're going to use this subsidy as an incentive to get employers to take a chance on our youth. Again, part of the difficulty is that the youth that we're working with have struggled with employment in the past, and they may have current barriers to employment. We want to use CYEP to give them a chance to get a job. And so what we're going to do is, some of you may know, especially if you were a provider last year, the length of time that we have the subsidy available decreased from 6 months to 3 months. We spent a lot of time discussing that and trying to think more about the purpose of the subsidy. Our main concern with the subsidy is that if a provider, or an employer partner is just using our CYEP program to get some free labor for a while, the concern is that once the subsidy goes away, that job will go away also. We don't want to put youth into jobs that are funded solely by the subsidy and that there's no plan to continue those jobs. We want to put youth into jobs that were already going to be in existence. So, for example, none of the jobs that we're placing youth in should be created by the Community Youth Employment Program. They should be jobs that were going to be filled one way or the other, with or without the CYEP. And the idea is then that if we've got youth, and we've got our youth, and they're competing with other applicants for jobs, we should be able to go to these employers and say, hey, we have youth participants. We're going to work with them and train them on dependability. We're going to work with them and train them on some academic skills. We're going to provide them with professional clothing or equipment tools that they need in order to get a job. And we are going to subsidize either all of or a large portion of that youth's wage for the first 3 months on the job, thus reducing the risk and the cost to the employer in hiring our youth. That's the hook. That's what we're going to do in order to get our youth employed. And so when it comes to these job placements, we are looking for employer partners who, who have a need for good employees and who are planning to fill these positions with or without the CYEP. We recognize that the employer partners are volunteers, right? So, for example, all of you are grantees. We give you grant funds and we expect you to do something with them, and you have a certain obligation or responsibility as a grantee. The employer partners, though, they enter into this agreement kind of voluntarily, and we recognize that, whereas with DHS and with many of you as agencies, your primary concern is the youth. Your primary concern is to serve the people in your community. We recognize that your employer partners, their primary concern is running a successful business. They are there to make money. They are there to do a job or provide a service or to produce a product or something. So we want to make sure that we are cognizant of the fact that our employer partners, what they're looking for decent employees who are going to show up and do the job. And we want to be able to provide them with employees from our CYEP participants. And again, the goal is the long term. So when you are working with employers, hopefully some of you have already started doing that. When you're working with employers, you're evaluating the employment opportunities in the area, and you are looking for people who are going to have jobs that need filled, and you should be setting up employer agreements with these employers. The requirements for employer agreements are listed in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and there also should be listed in your contract terms. It's really important that you put together a solid employer agreement. I had Yancey contact me today actually and ask me a little bit about employer agreements. There were some older employer agreement templates out on the WorkNet from previous CYEP programs. And I encourage Yancey, and I want to encourage each of you as well, not to use those employer agreements, or if you use them, to update them. They are old, they're outdated, and they're not very accurate anymore. And so I would encourage you to design your own employer agreement that meets the conditions set forth in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, because when we do compliance monitoring visits, it's one of the things that our compliance monitors are going to ask for are copies of your employer agreements. Everywhere where you place a youth, you are supposed to have an employer agreement in place. And the employer agreement is going to specify some conditions. It's going to specify that there's an expectation that the employer is going to provide long-term employment opportunities. The employer agreement should talk about background checks for anybody working with the youth. The employer agreement should include some commitments on the part of employers to fill out a worksite evaluation or to complete the participant employment termination reports. And the whole point is, we want to make sure that the people that we're working with as our employer partners are, that they're going to provide the best opportunities for youth to work long term. And so, and that they're going to be safe working environments, and that they're not just, using the program to get some free labor for a while, and with no intention of actually ever hiring the youth. So we're looking for some commitments up front. Certainly we understand that that the youth is, that no youth, I guess, has a guarantee of employment. For example, you could place a youth in a job, and if the youth screws up or does something dangerous or illegal or is just not dependable or whatever reason, we obviously don't expect that employer to hire on that youth forever. If the employer doesn't want to hire that youth, that's okay. What we want to avoid, though, are employers who have a pattern of kind of abusing the system and saying, yeah, we're going to give this person an opportunity, and then they always find a reason not to give that person an opportunity to work long term. Nanette, you had a question that says, is the employer agreement completed even if the placement is not subsidized? Yes. If it is a CYEP placement, that meaning it's something that our CYEP providers have arranged and that our participants are going to be working at, you need to have an employer agreement in place. The employer agreement should specify whether or not a job placement may end up being subsidized. So, for example, if you go to an employer and you say, hey, you and the employer work out an agreement, and you put something down on paper and say, we expect to be able to hire so many youth from the Community Youth Employment Program, even if it's only 2 youth, or even if it's only 1 youth, you could put together an agreement and just say, hey, we're going to offer this youth long-term employment opportunity. We're going to complete the requested employer evaluation, and that would apply again for subsidized or unsubsidized placements, because even if the placement is unsubsidized, we still have a responsibility to make sure that the employer has the appropriate background checks in place and that the workplace is going to be a safe site for the youth. And we recognize too that if a youth wants to go out and get a job completely on his own in an unsubsidized position, the youth can certainly do that. The youth, any such placement, though, would not be considered a community youth employment placement. The placements are the things that you as providers work out on behalf of the youth. And again, if the youth exits because he gets a job and he doesn't want to be in the youth employment program anymore, that's fine. We're glad that the youth has had an opportunity to go to work and that the youth wants to take the responsibility for him or herself and go get a job on his or her own. That's fine. We just would not consider that youth then a CYEP participant because we have not been the agent to place the youth in that job. And so, yes, we need to have those employer agreements in place. Those employer agreements are going to be really important because they're going to set out really the terms for the expectations involved with the placement. And so the expectations on both you as the provider's parts and on the employer's part. Once you make an employment placement, whether it's subsidized or unsubsidized, there's kind of an expectation that you will follow up. Over time, we want to make sure that the youth is being successful in the placement. That's especially important if the youth is in a subsidized placement. And here's why. We limit that subsidy to 3 months, 13 weeks, 90 days, however you want to break it down. It's 3 months. And we limit that placement, not the placement, we limit the subsidy for any particular youth to that length. And that's not per placement, it's per youth. So if a youth works for 2 months in a subsidized position and then gets fired, that youth only has 1 month of subsidy left. And we want to make sure that we are getting the most, that the youth really is getting the most bang for their buck here, because that subsidy, the whole point is it's a tool to help the youth get placed in employment. And once it's gone, you can still work with the youth to get placed. You're just not going to have that tool available to you. So we want to make sure that we're maximizing those resources. And part of that is making sure that the youth is doing well in the placement. So once we place the youth in a position, we need to be following up with the employer. We need to be following up with the youth and talking with the youth supervisor and just saying, hey, how is this youth doing on the job? Are there any things that we should be working with the youth? Are there anything? Is there anything that the youth needs that we could be helping the youth, come by? There are all kinds of things that we can be doing to try to ensure that the placement is successful, meaning it's working out well for the employer and the youth. And if it's not, we need to try to identify things that we could be doing to correct that. And that's why it's so important that we look early. If you wait until 3 months have come and gone, a youth subsidy is completely used up, and the employer now says, I no longer want to maintain this youth's employment. It's too late for the youth to continue to get more subsidy. You're not going to be able to have a second go at a subsidized placement. Now you're going to have to be able to place this youth in an unsubsidized placement. And so we want to make sure that we're doing follow-up. When it comes to the Illinois WorkNet, Natasha and I are working on a module for the worksite placements. Things that you'll want to keep in mind, things that we're going to be looking at asking about would be, the start date of the youth's job placement. We are going to send you, once you record the youth's job placement in the Illinois WorkNet, we are going to send you reminders to follow up and make sure that the youth is still employed, still doing well in the job placement. We are going to ask you what the applicable minimum wage is for the job placement. And I know we've had a lot of discussion about the applicable minimum wage. We have had lots of people question the applicable minimum wage that we've used, which is $7.75 an hour. I've emailed a number of you, especially a number of your fiscal people as well, when it came to approving the budgets. The applicable minimum wage, the state minimum wage is $8.25 an hour. However, for youth under the age of 18, it can be $7.75 an hour. There's a 50-cent differential. And even for youth over the age of 18, for youth who are adults, it can still be $7.75 an hour during their first 90 days of employment. Well, since our subsidy is only for 90 days, that's the maximum subsidy that we allow, theoretically, in the vast majority of cases, a youth's applicable minimum wage is going to be $7.75 an hour. I know that Chicago and Cook County, where a lot of our providers are located, they each have minimum wage ordinances that in most cases exceed the state minimum wage of $8.25 an hour. However, both the Chicago and the Cook County minimum wage have exceptions for the same classes of people that I just mentioned, for youth and for those in their first 90 days of employment. Both local minimum wage ordinances have exceptions, which would mean that in most cases the applicable minimum wage for those youth is going to be $7.75 an hour. We're going to ask you to record the applicable minimum wage in the Illinois WorkNet, and we do that for a couple reasons. One, we make it clear in the program standards that the youth's subsidized wage may not be more than the applicable minimum wage. So whatever the applicable minimum wage is, you cannot pay a subsidy more than that, okay? The other thing that we're going to ask is, what is the youth's actual wage? So the applicable minimum wage may be $7.75 an hour. The youth may be earning $10 an hour. And of that $10 an hour, you may be subsidizing $7.75 an hour, and the employer may be paying $2.25 an hour for a total combined wage of $10 an hour. Those are the things we're going to ask. We're going to ask, what is the applicable minimum wage for the position where the youth is working? And we're going to ask, what is the youth's actual earned wage per hour? And we're going to ask what portion of that earned wage, if any, is subsidized. And that's one thing I want to be really clear about, that a lot of people think that the subsidy, that if you subsidize a youth's wage, you have to subsidize 100% of it. You do not. You could subsidize $2 an hour. You could subsidize $1 an hour for the youth. You do not have to subsidize the youth's full wage. You can subsidize a part of the youth's wage. Now, if the youth's actual wage is $7.75 an hour, then and you are able to subsidize the full $7.75 an hour for that youth, because that is the maximum subsidy that you can give. So you could, if the youth was earning the applicable minimum wage of $7.75 an hour during the subsidized period, during his first 90 days of employment, you could subsidize 100% of the wage. But I want to make it clear, you certainly don't have to. You can, and that's what the employer agreements are for too. You can work this out with the employers, and you can specify. You know, the employer, the youth is going to earn $10 an hour for the first 90 days. The employer will subsidize so much per hour. The community youth employment program will subsidize so much per hour. After those 90 days, the employer will pay 100% of the wage, and the community youth employment program will pay 0% of the wage, something like that. You can spell those things out in your employer agreements, but I want people to understand the nature of the subsidy. And the subsidy, again, its benefit is not really to the youth. I know we think that. We talk about that the subsidy is there to pay the youth, and ultimately the money goes to the youth, but it's not as if it's just given to the youth. The youth is working a job, is working a number of hours to earn that wage. And if the youth were working for an employer outside of the community youth employment program, the youth would still be getting that same wage. So the subsidized wage is not really a benefit so much to the youth. The subsidized wage is a benefit to the employer, because the employer is the one who is getting the free labor. The youth is getting paid for their work, but the youth would be getting paid for work no matter where they worked, with or without the CYEP. So whereas it's not really a gift to the youth, it is a gift to the employer. That is the benefit to employers of using the subsidy. And so the question is, how much of a subsidy do you need in order to get the employer to want to participate with you? That's how we are supposed to be using the subsidy. And so what we're going to do in the Illinois WorkNet system, we're going to be recording those job placements. We're going to be asking you about the wage information for the youth and what the youth is doing. And then eventually, we'll use that for reporting. So if the primary goal is to place youth into long-term jobs, we mentioned that one of our performance measures is, how many youth have been working for at least 3 months, how many youth have been working for at least 6 months, at least 9 months, etc. I recognize that this grant program is only an 8-month program, and many of you will just be putting youth to work after maybe a couple months of getting started and getting the program off the ground and recruiting youth and doing training, things like that. So you may not have 8 months by the end of the year in order to get these youth employed for that full time. But the idea is, as long as we can, we want to try to get those youth employed, and we want to measure how many of them are still employed at the end of 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months. Ideally, and we keep discussing this, and we are hoping here at DHS that this is going to be the case, but ideally, at the end of fiscal year 2018, here at the end of June, we will be able to continue the program. And ideally, it'll just continue into FY19, starting July 1. And those youth that you have been working with during FY18, you would continue to be able to work with in FY19, and you would be able to continue to track their progress. And so hopefully we will eventually get to a point where you'll be able to measure the youth that you've been serving, and you'll be able to measure those who have maintained their initial employment for 9 months or more. And so that's ultimately the goal, is we're looking for the long-term employment for the youth. Okay? Are there any questions so far? All right. I just wanted to be clear that that's kind of the next big thing that we're looking at in the Illinois WorkNet that Natasha and I are working on. The next big thing really is developing the worksite placement module for the Illinois WorkNet. And again, what we'll use that for, that will be your opportunity. When you've got youth participants, you'll be able to go in and, and to, basically record the youth's job placement. And that will be used as a measure of your performance. And that's really going to be a core measure for performance for the Community Youth Employment Program, is the long-term job placement for the youth. Okay? I hope that you are casting a broad net, too, when you are looking for jobs in which to place youth. I do want to remind you that, and we say this several times in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, but I want to be really clear on this, too. Youth can work for your organization as part of the Community Youth Employment Program. Your participants, so for example, if your organization had a long-term job, and again, not something that's created just for the CYEP, but you have a long-term job that you're going to be filling regardless, you can place youth in that job. What you cannot do is use any portion of CYEP funds to subsidize that youth's job, because that would create a conflict of interest. But you can use youth in the program at your organization. But I want you to kind of cast a broad net and to be thinking largely about where these youth might be able to work. You know your area as well as anybody. You know what jobs are available. You know what major employers in the area. You know what opportunities are going to be available. And we want you to really be thinking about what's going to provide the best opportunities for long-term employment, something where these youth may be able to work for some time, and we want you to work with those employers. You might have lots and lots of different employers where you set up employer agreements and you place these youth. They don't necessarily have to be, I know some people think, well, I've got to find like a manufacturing firm that's going to commit to providing 20 jobs for the Youth Employment Program. But it's nice if you can find something like that, but you certainly don't have to. You could work at with one employer and set up an employer agreement, and that employer may only have 1 or 2 jobs available. And then you would go to another employer and work out an agreement and say, hey, I've got this pool of youth that we're going to be working with to train and make sure that they're professionally equipped to come to work. I would encourage you, be looking at help wanted ads. Be looking at websites like monster.com that post jobs online. Be looking for where there are jobs available, and be looking at the skills that are needed for those jobs, and see if your youth would be a decent fit. And reach out to those employers and say, hey, I noticed that you had a job opening. I've got some people that I work with that I would vouch for that would make great employees. And if there's anything we could do to help prepare them, we'd be willing to put in some preparation on the front end to help prepare them. And reach out to employers. Again, you're looking for jobs that were going to be filled regardless of CYEP. So, I wouldn't call an employer who doesn't already have a job opening posted and say, hey, I've got youth, and if you would hire them for a while, we could subsidize their wage and you get some free labor for a while. Again, that's not what the CYEP program is for. We're looking for people who already have jobs available that they were planning to hire. Because if we don't approach it that way, if we approach it as the CYEP is going to create the jobs, the problem is the CYEP, the subsidy, it's temporary. The amount of services that we can provide to the youth are temporary. We don't want the jobs to be temporary. We want the employment to be long-term. we want the initial support to be temporary, but we want the employment to be long-term. Yancey had a question that said, would we be able to subsidize youth with a temp-to-hire agency? That's tricky. Potentially. I'm going to say maybe you could. Again, with the idea being that, you know, if the end goal is expected to be that the youth is going to have a long-term job, that whatever the temp agency is doing is you know, it starts temporary, but there's an expectation that it's going to become permanent or long-term, then potentially we could do that. That one concerns me a little bit, again, just because the main idea is for the long-term job opportunity, and, you know, temp agencies, by their very nature, tend to focus on temporary employment, and which we really don't want to do. So I would say potentially, but just be really careful and make sure that the expectation is that the youth is going to have long-term employment. Looks like maybe one more question here, or if anybody else has questions, let me know. We will, by the way, plan to have a webinar next week, and again, I apologize this week that I don't have much to say about the actual Illinois WorkNet, only because it is, you know, we were still in a design phase right at the moment, and Natasha is out, but we will have another webinar next week, and Natasha should be in with some better information on some of the new modules that we've been working on. So. Yancey says a lot of our manufacturing companies use temp-to-hire agencies with hiring into the company after 90 days. So that's a really interesting prospect. I would say in that circumstance, that would potentially be allowable. Again, as long as the expectation is that they plan to hire after 90 days, or at least there's a decent chance that the youth would be hired after 90 days. I would say that would be allowable then. Again, you might just steer away from those kinds of employers, but if those are your best options, if those are going to be your best options for employing youth with lower skills, and that's going to be the best job opportunity for them in the area, then that may be the route you need to go. But you know, I would encourage you to look elsewhere if you can. And again, we talked about, I know this, we talked about this on previous webinars, that any work is good. It's a good start. You know, the purpose of the Youth Employment Program really is for kind of some initial employment that we expect that the youth that we're serving have really not been successful in work in the past, and we want to get them to that point. And there's this idea of activation energy that, for example, you know, it's this idea of a snowball sitting at the top of a hill, and it may not get started on its own, but with a little activation energy, you can get that ball rolling, and it'll keep rolling once it gets started. That's kind of the idea with the Youth Employment Program, is that we expect that eventually employment will become sustainable for youth, that the employment that they get will lead to other and better employment, that they'll have experience, and each employment experience that they gain will help them build new skills, which should help them build better employment opportunities in the future. That's the idea behind CYEP. And so any employment that they get, we consider useful for our youth. But obviously, you know, if we can steer youth towards employment that's going to lead towards a particular career, that's great. That's all the better. But even if we're not, so for example, maybe a youth doesn't want to work in food service forever, but you could get them some initial employment in food service to start with, we're going to call that a success for the youth. And then we're going to use that to try to plan for future opportunities for the youth, future employment and education opportunities, and figure out, how this employment is going to meet the immediate needs of the youth, but how it's also then going to help build up skills for long-term for the youth. Okay? Any other questions? All right, guys. Well, I appreciate you attending the webinar today. It looks like we have a good group attending the webinar today. I really appreciate that. We will have, a webinar next Wednesday at 1:30 at the same time and place. So that would be the 10th of January. And like I say, Natasha should be back, and I look forward to having you then. Other than that, we are concluded for the day. Thanks for joining us.